Alex Pretti, a 37-year-old VA nurse, was shot and killed by federal ICE agents on Saturday while filming them in the street in Minneapolis. His killing comes less than 3 weeks after ICE officers killed Renee Good, part of a surge of ICE enforcement that has prompted mass protests by residents and opposition from state officials and local law enforcement. Here to help us sort through the evolving narrative is Chris Hand, government expert, attorney, and political guru all around. Chris, you join us every month to talk politics and policy, but we asked you if you'd come on specially today to talk about this and what's happening in Minneapolis. Just a terrible tragedy there this weekend.
It is, Anna. There are certain moments over history that have been seared into the American consciousness, and it feels very much like the events in Minneapolis this weekend, particularly combined with what happened 3 weeks ago when Renee Good was shot, now with Alex Pretti. It is going to be one of those moments that is truly seared in American memories. So many different sort of aspects come together. Of course, you point out the most important one, the terrible tragedy and the sort of loss of life and the grief that a family and a state and a country is now going through, but also the governmental implications. By all accounts, and of course, there's still investigation to be done, and I think it's important for that to happen and to be able to get a full accounting of the events there. But, we do have videotape of that event, and from the video we've seen, it does appear that an American citizen who was exercising his First Amendment right to peaceably assemble and his Second Amendment right to lawfully bear arms was shot and killed in Minnesota by these ICE officers in the midst of an enforcement regime. I think you've seen reaction from all parts of the both political and governmental spectrum. You've seen members of Congress really on both sides of the aisle expressing concern about what happened and demanding investigations. Even, in the case of some House committee chairs calling federal officials to testify before the committee. But again, members of Congress on both Republican and Democrat calling for full and transparent investigations. You've seen sort of unlikely groups take the same position. For example, in the aftermath of this shooting, as members of the Trump administration sort of attempted to defend it and provide their perspective on what happened there, you had groups like the National Rifle Association and other Second Amendment advocates come out and say he had every right to lawfully carry, arms at that, with what he was doing. So I think it's going to be an event we're talking about for quite some time because of all of the implications politically, governmentally, what this means for ICE enforcement going forward. And as you know, the United States Senate this week is considering appropriations legislation that would keep the government funded for, a significant period of time. One of the funding bills that's part of that is the Department of Homeland Security. Essentially, enough Democrats in the Senate have now said they will not provide the votes for that bill, that if it is not stripped out of this funding package, that I think the odds of a government shutdown on Friday, January the 30th, are now, if not certain, very close to it.
I think a lot of people may have experienced some whiplash, as I did certainly on Saturday, because, the first news report that I heard on NPR was of a man brandishing a 9mm handgun and reports that he had, approached law enforcement with an intent to kill law enforcement. A situation, Gregory Bovino, the Border Patrol official, said it looked as if he wanted to do maximum damage and massacre law enforcement. And so the initial reports were almost sounded like somebody that had shown up to do a mass shooting. Of course, the video shows nothing of the kind. And separate analysis by the Wall Street Journal, CBS News, the AP, and the New York Times all concluded that the videos just straight up contradict the administration's description of the killing. So while this is perhaps going to be seared in our memory for the tragedy, is it in any way a turning point in terms of political conversations around this administration's approach to the truth, approach to facts?
Yes, because I think this one incident is seeing, one of the themes we've seen over the last year of the Trump administration is either the bending or the breaking of governmental or constitutional norms. I think we're seeing that in a particularly magnified way with this incident. Number one, the official statements from high-profile government officials, the director of the FBI, the Secretary of Homeland Security, again, as you say, justifying the events with a kind of a depiction of the event that seems to be completely opposite from what this video shows, and I think why these investigations will be so important. But also in the way they're kind of providing accountability and conducting an investigation. The Washington Post reported over the weekend that in a major break from the way these investigations are particularly conducted, typically, and according to the Post, when there is an officer-involved shooting involving a federal law enforcement officer, the Department of Justice takes the lead in that investigation, deploys FBI agents and prosecutors from the DOJ's Office of Civil Rights to investigate that shooting. The DOJ appears has been sidelined in this investigation. Same with the FBI. The Department of Homeland Security appears to be, whatever investigation's occurring, tends to be doing that themselves. And DHS has been sort of blocking state law enforcement authorities from their ability to investigate this, something which clearly is concurrent jurisdiction between both the federal government and the state government, to the point where the state government actually went to court to make sure they could preserve evidence from the crime for their own, from the shooting for their own investigation. So there's a lot of concern now about, what this incident means for not just constitutional norms, but also law enforcement norms, and of course the norm of federal officials leveling and providing that duty of candor to the public in the pursuit of their duties.
And one norm that seems to be being violated, and we have some video of some of the enforcement actions that have been taken against citizens who are peaceably protesting, and they are shocking, to say the least. People being shot in the face with tear gas and chemical sprays, people who are even restrained being kind of punitively sprayed. I saw videos this weekend of, these officers driving down the street and sort of randomly shooting at people who were in the streets protesting their presence. And so it is not anything like we've seen before in a lot of ways. And there's been a tremendous amount of public resistance, even on this unbelievably frigidly cold weekend in Minneapolis.
Well, certainly not something that we've seen in a long time. I mean, as soon as I heard about this horrific incident, my thoughts immediately went to the early 1970s and the shooting of protesters at Kent State University and Jackson State University who were peaceably protesting the Vietnam War. This feels like a moment very much like that moment where there's a clash between, again, these crucial First Amendment values, the right to peaceably protest, and how those are managed in this situation. And so, again, much like those searing moments, I think this will be another one of those that's going to have ramifications for government at every level, for our federal system. I think for the Trump administration, even though I think immigration was a major reason he was elected for a second term in 2024, his popularity is obviously very much underwater right now, including on the issue of immigration. There's rising skepticism about the approach the administration is taking, I think due to a lot of factors, including these incidents, but others as well. It reported over the weekend that in 2026 alone, 6 detainees have died while in ICE custody. In 2025, it was 30. These are numbers that are significantly more than in past administrations. So I think there's going to be significant congressional and public focus on the administration's immigration policy. We'll have to watch and see if the administration decides to pull that back. Just, for example, over the weekend, the very conservative governor of Oklahoma, Kevin Stitt, called for the president to pull out of Minneapolis and situations where there are likely to be these clashes and this sort of chaos, and maybe focus ICE's efforts in other places as well. So again, notable some of the people who are now speaking out about this issue who weren't previously. I think that attests to the searing nature of what happened in Minneapolis this weekend.
Interesting, too, that you mentioned that, because a Republican, James Comer, who's the chair of the House Oversight Committee, was also saying that perhaps they should pull ICE out of Minneapolis. He was saying it more because they're mistreating our ICE agents, but even he was saying maybe we should move to another city and let the people of Minneapolis decide if they want to continue or not. We are talking to Chris Hand about the weekend's events in Minneapolis. If you would like to join the conversation, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can email First Coast Connect at wjct.org or go to firstcoastconnect.org. We've got a call from Tom on the west side. Good morning, Tom. Go ahead.
Good morning to y'all. Just want to point out that from the very inception of this stepped-up ICE activity. There have been so many instances of random violence, of officers just pushing, shoving, spraying people just at random who are just standing around. And if there was any accountability at this early stage where these problems were showing up, these two people would still be alive. But no, the problem was allowed to fester and get worse, and that's where we are today.
Tom, thanks so much. We've got a call from Charles on the west side. Good morning, Charles. Go ahead.
Good morning. Chris, I had a comment and a question. My question is, do you see the Trump administration painting the Senate's efforts to rein in these abuses and, call for reform measures being portrayed as a defund the police type propaganda? And the other thing I want to ask the American people is, all the billions that have been spent on Trump's private army, it's not going away. All the cameras, surveillance equipment, all that is going to remain, and that's going to be used to police the American citizen and surveil us. So that's what I'm alarmed about. Thanks.
There's so much, Charles. Chris, the issue of surveillance is one that has continued to become more concerning for people there. Obviously, there are reports and acknowledgments that they're building a database of people who are peacefully protesting. But there are also systems that are used by law enforcement to track people, but that are perhaps now being used to track them if they're providing aid to people who are, hiding out. There's also questions about what will be done with that information. And then now we're learning that Pam Bondi, the head of the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, is asking for information on voter rolls and aid to the poor. People who receive those benefits now wants that information to be turned over to the federal government.
I think, Ann, there's a lot of questions about kind of what that's all about, right? And why those requests are being made at this point. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about potential welfare fraud in the state of Minnesota. What that has to do with voter rolls, I think, is very unclear at this point. And I think, to the caller's point about the Senate, we're likely to see very strong pushback, not just by Democrats, but also by some Republicans on a variety of these issues that are related to kind of ICE's efforts in Minnesota and other places as well. Not just the surveillance point, but the potential training and conduct of some ICE officers, and as you referred to earlier, these will all be part of the Senate discussion. I think that's going to be a very important part of this issue. To what extent? Remember, Congress, by our Constitution, is a co-equal branch of government. So a lot of this will depend on how aggressively Congress utilizes its oversight authority. And again, over the weekend, we saw members of both parties suggesting that it would, to some extent, whether that's from an investigatory standpoint or in the case of Senate Democrats from a budget standpoint, try to use some of that authority. So that's some of what we'll watch. Just this morning, just in terms of watching what the administration itself is doing, after some of these initial claims were made about what happened over the weekend in Minnesota, they seem to back off those claims and some of their subsequent kind of media appearances. This morning, the president announced that he was sending Tom Homan, who's his appointed border czar, to Minnesota. It'll be interesting to see if that reflects some kind of strategic shift. And according to a lot of reporting, there's been kind of two camps in the administration, Mr. Homan in one, who wanted to focus the administration's immigration efforts more in sort of red states, places along the southern border, places where they were more likely to find, larger numbers of potentially undocumented immigrants, and a camp led by the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Noam, who wanted to have these sorts of high-profile enforcement actions in blue states, places like Minnesota.
And more confrontational, perhaps.
Exactly. The president's decision to send Mr. Homan to Minnesota, we don't know exactly what that will mean yet, but it is possible that reflects some sort of strategic shift. He, in Truth Social, he said he's sending him to Minnesota and he's going to report directly to President Trump. So I think it'll be important to watch that over the next 24 to 48 hours. Does Mr. Homan's presence reflect a strategic shift of some kind? And whether it does or doesn't, to what extent is Congress going to provide oversight, both in terms of investigations and in terms of that key budget vote that would fund the Department of Homeland Security going forward.
We have a call from Ed in Orange Park. Good morning, Ed. Go ahead.
Good morning. I have a question. How come is it that here in Florida, where we have, number one, a lot nicer weather to protest, and we have about 6 million legal immigrants in Florida and about another 500,000 to 1 million undocumented, which is more than the entire population of Minnesota. We don't see this situation happening at all. And you would think that we would have a lot more emphasis in that type of cases that we're seeing. Also, if people peacefully, if any group of us here in this area goes and try to block roads or entrance to the building, let's say the building to the studio there where you guys are at, is that legal? If we're doing it peacefully, we refuse to move. Is that legal? Is that okay?
Thanks, Ed.
Well, Ed, good questions. It depends very much on the laws of the individual jurisdiction, sort of, that we do have a fundamental right to protest. We don't have a right to kind of block other people's access to buildings or interfere with other people's ability to sort of live their lives. So, yes, there are, we see it all the time. Protesters are arrested for, when they peaceably assemble but do something that otherwise violates the law. They, are arrested. I think what distinguishes this incident from many others, or maybe some of the incidents we've seen, is that, typically, law enforcement agencies, which work very hard to be responsible in these instances and oftentimes to work with groups that are organizing, they undergo significant training to know how to deal with peaceful protesters and what to do when they do violate the law. I think what has shocked the conscience of some as it relates to these ICE matters is that those typical law enforcement procedures we often see in protest situations, at least in some cases, don't seem to be followed. And there's a much more aggressive approach that seems to have been taken. I think this is likely to be the subject of some of these investigations that go forward. Is ICE using the proper procedures to deal with people who are truly peacefully protesting? Are ICE officers receiving the proper training to know what those procedures are and to be able to implement them? And if not, who's accountable for that? I think all of these will be questions of the congressional investigations of this to come.
And in terms of his initial question as to why we're not seeing that here in Florida, certainly the size of the surge, this Operation Metro surge that's been happening in Minneapolis, is outsized to anything we've seen in Florida so far.
That's correct. And it's been concentrated in a particular area. This area of Minneapolis is where this surge has occurred. Florida, as Ed pointed out, a very large state. There have been ICE operations in Florida. Florida has a variety of laws in place in terms of cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE. This has been a state that has been, I think, more aligned with the federal government in terms of law enforcement. So that may have something to do with it. But again, I think, as Ann pointed out, the special nature of this surge in Minneapolis, I think, has, probably been, part contributing factor to some of what we've seen.
We've got a call from Tim in Orange Park. Good morning, Tim. Go ahead.
Good morning. I was wondering if the president applied the Insurrection Act, would that hinder the midterm elections? And I will take my answer off the phone. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I've heard a lot of questions about that lately, Chris. People asking me as a reporter as well, will there be midterm elections?
Yes, there will be midterm elections. And, the Insurrection Act is something that does exist. It was passed in the first decade of the 19th century. It does allow, in extraordinary circumstances, for a president to utilize the actual U.S. military to quell civil disobedience. It's been used very few times in American history. I think the last president before President Trump to use it was President Bush briefly, the first President Bush during the L.A. riots in 1992. So it is something that is used extraordinarily and sparingly. If President Trump invoked it, I think we could be certain that there would be immediate litigation about his use of the Insurrection Act. But the Insurrection Act is also not a blank check and does not give the president the power to suspend elections or anything like that. It is supposedly focused on very specific instances. So, yes, I think we are going to have midterm elections in 2026. I think the most important way to ensure that we not only have midterm elections in 2026, but also that our democracy continues to flourish, is for every person to use their effective citizenship skills to communicate with their members of Congress and their other elected officials to make their priorities known. And if you have concerns about this or anything else, make sure you're communicating to your elected officials. But I do believe we're going to have midterm elections in 2026 and a presidential election in 2028.
I did want to ask you about that. I mean, you are our advocate for government participation, and you are always urging people to get involved. This feels maybe far away for people in some ways, but what do our congressmen or our senators have to do in this? What would you ask people to do or suggest people do if they are concerned about what they're seeing in Minneapolis?
Whatever your position is on any federal issue, and this is a federal issue, make sure you make that position known to your elected official. Everybody, in our listening area is represented by one member of Congress and two United States senators. If you live in Florida, those are two particular U.S. senators and a particular congressperson. If you live in Georgia, that's three other elected officials. But it's important to communicate with them and make sure they understand what your position on these issues are. To the extent they hold town hall meetings, attend those town hall meetings, ask your questions. I think it's important to be respectful, don't be disruptive, but be firm in your convictions about whatever you feel on a particular issue. When I kind of talk to people about effective citizenship and make very clear it's not remotely my job to encourage you as to what you should say to them or what your opinion should be, but whatever that is, make sure your elected officials know that. That is the bedrock on which our representative democracy system exists.
Well, Chris Hand, we appreciate you coming in this morning. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of our calls and questions, but this is an important conversation we'll continue to have. So thanks so much for coming in today on short notice.
Thank you, Ann. I'll see you early next month.